Hi, I'm Dr. Leslie Blankenship-Williams, and if you are enrolled in my physiology class, we have two organ systems left to cover. They are the endocrine system and the reproductive system. Now we are going to spend quite a bit of time learning about the endocrine system, and then we're going to use our newfound knowledge of the endocrinology to look at reproduction. In other words, we're specifically looking at reproduction through an endocrine lens. We'll be looking at reproductive endocrinology. But I get ahead of myself. Here, we are just introducing some major themes associated with the endocrine system. So endocrinology is the study of the endocrine system, which is comprised of hormones. In other words, we're looking at hormones as a way for cells to talk to each other. So of course, let's take a look at what is a hormone, what is a target cell, what are some of their responses, and then we'll revisit some of the hormones that we've already learned about in this class. All right, let's start with what is a hormone. I have here a list of 3 criteria that are generally accepted as needing to be fulfilled in order for some chemical to be called a hormone. And I say generally because there's some arguments about what is and is not a hormone. So there's some gray area here. But in general, obviously it needs to be a chemical signal, not an electrical one. And its target needs to be farther away from the point of secretion, such that it requires the blood to travel to said target. There might be more than one target, but at least it's going to need the blood to travel to a target farther away. And it's effective in really small concentrations. In fact, when you assay or measure the hormone levels in the blood, it's not uncommon to find measurements in picograms per milliliter or nanograms per milliliter. So those are really, really, really small concentrations. So next, let's take a look at who secretes hormones. Most hormones are secreted from what I call generic cells. They just kind of look like your generic amorphous roundish cells. And you can see images of some of those endocrine cells in the left picture of the pancreas. So when you take a look at the image on the left, you can see that these are kind of generic looking cells. You might ask yourself, well, how come some are lighter than others? Well, that is because the pancreas has both endocrine and exocrine function. And if you did not encounter those terms in your anatomy class, I will quickly clarify them for you here, although I personally do not test on this. An exocrine gland is going to be one that secretes a chemical that travels usually via a duct or a tube to something outside of the body. So a classic example of exocrine would be pheromones, something that's secreted on the skin. But it can also be digestive enzymes. So these are going to be digestive enzymes that are secreted via ducts and tubes into the duodenum of the small intestine and start digesting your food. And yes, the duodenum of your small intestine, or at least the internal part of it, the lumen, is considered to be outside of your body. Endocrine glands are going to be collections of cells that secrete hormones into the bloodstream. Usually there's no duct involved, there's no tube. So in this picture here, these are all endocrine cells. And in fact, we're going to learn more about that collection of endocrine cells in a subsequent lecture. So hormones can be secreted from generic cells, but they can also be secreted from neurons. Now, if they are secreted from neurons, they are secreted from the axon terminals. And we've learned about neurons and we've learned about secreting stuff from axon terminals, but when we tend to think about what is secreted from axon terminals, we tend to think about neurotransmitters that are going to diffuse across the synaptic cleft and bind to the cell next door. That makes neurotransmitters a type of paracrine. But maybe there's no neuron next door. Maybe instead we're secreting something and it just diffuses right into the bloodstream and gets carried away. If that's the case and the target is farther away, then it's probably a hormone. And so if you do have a hormone that is secreted from the end of a neuron, we call those neurohormones. So other than the fact that the neurohormones are secreted from the brain, which is where we have those neurons, I'm not going to say that there's anything like particularly special about neurohormones. In fact, we've already covered one. Vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone is a neurohormone. You might say to yourself, why? Why would vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone be a neurohormone? Well, let me ask you this. What is the advantage of being secreted from the brain? Well, one of the major triggers for secretion of antidiuretic hormone is going to be the information from the osmoreceptors, which are located in the hypothalamus, the brain. So it makes sense then that when the osmoreceptors sense, hey, the osmolarity of the blood is getting pretty high and the blood pressure is kind of low, that the osmoreceptors basically trigger specialized neurons to secrete antidiuretic hormone, also located in the brain. It's a simpler pathway that way. Okay, so if you see the prefix neuro, it simply means that hormone is secreted from a neuron. Otherwise, it's just secreted from a generic cell somewhere in the body. So that brings us to the next question, which is where in the body are hormones secreted from? Like anatomically, where in the body? And if I were to ask you to point, where is the endocrine system? You would be wise to do something like this. All over the place, right? Especially in the core. And this image here kind of gives you a visual representation of some of the major organs that are involved in secreting hormones. You might also notice that some of these organs seem to have other functions as well. For instance, you might notice that ovaries and testes are down there and kidneys are there. And when I ask you, what do the kidneys do? Your first answer is probably not, it makes hormones. Instead, you might think removes waste, adjusts blood chemistry, all of that. In other words, nephrons, not hormones. Likewise, when we think about the ovaries or the testes, your first answer is probably makes eggs and sperm, not makes hormones. So a lot of hormones are secreted from specialized cells within organs that do other things as well. Although sometimes the organs just make hormones, and we call those true endocrine organs. We'll take a look at those in a moment. But before we do, I want to show you how endocrinology is often taught. So you'll notice first, if you look at the endocrine glands here, that the list of organs that participate in endocrinology is greater than the picture I showed you. You'll see some things on here, the heart, the liver, the skin, the stomach. Those were not in the picture. You'll also notice that there's a ton of information on this, but it is definitely organized by who's secreting it, what's the hormone, what's their target, and what's their effect. And I'll just pick one, don't write this down, but I'll just pick one, the parathyroid hormone, which is right here. So the parathyroid hormone is secreted by the parathyroid glands. These are actually little glands that are on the backside of the thyroid, which is around there. And it targets things like bone to liquidate calcium, to add calcium into your blood. Now, an approach to this class is to simply flashcard it. Memorize what the hormone is, where it's secreted from, what its major target is, and what its effect is. I personally don't take that approach. That is a classic approach, but it's not the one we're going to take in my class. Instead, we're going to focus on specific physiological functions. And we're going to look at the hormones that control those functions. And we're going to look at three big ones. We're going to look at glucose and how glucose levels are regulated in the blood. We're going to look at the hypothalamic pituitary unit and how it affects cortisol. And then finally, we're going to take a look at the reproductive system. And when you see those in details, you'll start to see the themes, the trends that will allow you to basically go back and learn about any hormone and hopefully have the knowledge base to understand how that hormone works. In other words, you've been exposed to the details of how specific hormones work such that you can apply that knowledge and quickly learn about any other hormone that you'd like to. Let's come back to this idea that certain organs do nothing else but make and secrete hormones. In other words, they are your true endocrine organs, your true endocrine glands. They're not dividing their resources up where they're doing, a big thing over here and they're an endocrine organ on the side. They are just endocrine organs. And there's a couple different places for these. one of which is in the Pituitary Gland, which is in kind of the center-ish of the brain. And the Pituitary Gland, as we will learn, is broken up into two parts, anterior and posterior. And the anterior is towards the front and the posterior is towards the back. And the anterior Pituitary Gland is the true endocrine gland. The thyroid and the parathyroid glands are also true endocrine glands, and then the adrenal glands, which are on top of the kidneys, are also true endocrine glands. So please go ahead and write those down as your true endocrine organs, and then we're going to take a look at target cells. So if I have some random hormone that I secrete into the bloodstream, which cells are going to be listening to that hormone and responding to it? And the answer is only cells with a receptor. So in order to be classified as a target cell, you have to have a receptor. And so you can see here this generic picture of a cell. The hormone is the diamond binds to the receptor, and there's a response. But if that cell does not have a receptor, then the hormone has no influence or impact on that cell. The cell is blind or deaf to that particular hormone. It doesn't even know it's there, and it has no response. So only cells with a receptor are target cells. And that's true whether or not you are a generic endocrine cell or a neuron secreting hormones. If you'd like to draw something down, you can draw this down. I have two generic looking cells. One is displaying a receptor for this green circle hormone, whatever that green circle hormone is. You can probably see that that circle fits very nicely into that receptor. And so by definition, the cell on the left is in fact going to be a target cell. It will have a response. But the cell on the right has no receptor. And because it has no receptor for the green hormone, it is not a target cell, and therefore will not be impacted, affected, or influenced by that green hormone when it swims by. Now, that's not to say that the cell on the right doesn't have other receptors that bind other hormones or other chemical signals, but not the green circle. So it's really simple. A target cell is defined as any cell that expresses a receptor for that hormone. Okay, now let's come back and take a look at some of the hormones that we have encountered in this class. I'd like you to take a moment, pause the video, and copy down this table because we're going to be filling it in. All right, did you do it? Awesome. So you'll recognize that some of these hormones we've covered recently and some are blasts from our past. And we're basically kind of mimicking the table that I showed you earlier. I'm wondering who it's secreted by, what its target cell is, and what its major effect is. I'm not going to fill in all of this for you. Some of this I'm going to leave blank and have you fill in from your prior notes. But I'll definitely try to walk you through the level of detail that I want you to own about these hormones that we've already covered. So let's go ahead and start with your erythropoietin or EPO. We did not cover this in a prior lecture, so this is new information. EPO is secreted from kidney cells that are not part of the nephron. However, we do know its target. So what is its target? Well, its target is going to be cells that are capable of making new red blood cells, because when we think about the effect of erythropoietin, it's to increase the red blood cell count. Well, how do you do that? Well, you go after the stem cells that make red blood cells and you tell them, hey, divide and differentiate into erythrocytes, which are red blood cells. So what cells do that? These are the multipotent stem cells called hematopoietic stem cells that are concentrated in the red bone marrow of adults. So now you might say, oh, okay, great. I know the effect is to make more red blood cells. And that's true, but this is an upper division physiology class. We want to dig a little bit deeper. What is its mechanism? when EPO targets the hematopoietic stem cell or binds to the hematopoietic stem cell, what's it actually telling the hematopoietic stem cell to do? It's actually telling that hematopoietic stem cell to divide and make two cells. One is going to stay a stem cell and the other is going to differentiate into a erythrocyte. So that is the effect. The outcome is adding more red blood cells to our circulation, but the effect on the target cell is to induce cellular division and differentiation. Okay, now let's take a look at vasopressin. Vasopressin is one we covered in recent lectures. That said, you may not recall where it was secreted from. And I'm going to just tell you now so that you have it in your brain, although we will see this again in a future lecture. And that is the posterior pituitary gland. We also know its effect. We know that vasopressin is going to cause the insertion of additional aquaporins into collecting duct tubule cells in the nephron. So again, you might be tempted to say the effect is to increase water reabsorption, and that's the outcome, but the actual mechanical effect is to insert more aquaporins in the collecting duct. So from that information, can you guess what the target cell is? Hopefully you can, because I'm not going to tell you what the answer is. All right, let's take a look at aldosterone. In this case, I'm not going to tell you where aldosterone is secreted from. You can go look that up. And the mechanistic effect was covered ad nauseum in a previous lecture, so I'll have you look at that. But I will tell you the target cell just so that you can see the theme. The target cell is going to be the distal tubule cells in the nephron. Now's the chance to pause the video and fill in the rest of the information for aldosterone and vasopressin if you have not yet done so. All right, our last hormone is going to be epinephrine. And this one I am going to walk you through because it's difficult. So epinephrine is a hormone that we've seen throughout the entire course. We've seen it pop up over and over again, but most often with the cardiovascular system. So epinephrine is actually secreted also from the adrenal glands. Now, aldosterone is also secreted from the adrenal glands. And at this point, we should probably take a look at the adrenal glands because they're not secreted from the same spots. So the adrenal glands are located on top of the kidney. So this is going to be adrenal on top of the kidney. That's the term, adrenal. Makes sense. The adrenal gland is actually two different tissues that live together in the same anatomical location, even though they are vastly different tissue types. When you look at them under a microscope, you can see the definite differences in tissue types. The outer layer is called the cortex, and the inner layer is the medulla, which means middle. And these phrases, cortex and medulla, were also used for the kidney, so you should be familiar with them. The adrenal medulla secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine, which remember is its partner in crime. So epinephrine and norepinephrine. The adrenal cortex secretes a variety of hormones, all of which are derived from cholesterol. You don't need to put that down yet, we'll talk about that. But the two that I want you to know, because we're going to cover them in detail, aldosterone, which we've already covered, and cortisol, which we will be covering. So the adrenal cortex is responsible for secreting aldosterone and cortisol. All right, let's come back to epinephrine now that we know that it's secreted from the middle of the adrenal glands. So epinephrine is secreted from the adrenal medulla, and again, the term adrenaline makes sense, right? Adrenal glands, adrenaline, epinephrine. What are the target cells? If you think about what epinephrine does, you're probably thinking fight or flight, or the sympathetic nervous system. Oh, you're not wrong. It absolutely is involved in that. But what cells are going to be responsible for that fight or flight response? That's a little bit of a harder question. But now I really want you to think about it. Think about what the effects are. Most of the effects are on the vascular system, taking our blood vessels and either constricting the diameter or expanding the diameter, vasoconstriction and vasodilation, respectively. Vasoconstriction is going to go ahead and constrict or reduce the diameter and make it more difficult for blood to flow through that tube. So if you want to move blood from one organ to another, you're going to vasoconstrict this one and vasodilate that one. In the fight or flight response, we tend to divert blood away from the digestive system towards skeletal muscles. So both vasodilation and vasoconstriction are going to happen, just depends on which blood vessel you are. In addition, the heart also responds to epinephrine and norepinephrine, and the heart has two different cell types that we've covered: autorhythmic cells, also known as pacemaker cells, and contractile cells. Both of them respond to epinephrine, but do so in a different way. The pacemaker cells increase their pacemaker potential so that your heart rate increases. The contractile cells generate a faster and quicker contraction to increase your stroke volume. So if we think about our target cells, we could summarize as smooth and cardiac muscle, because the smooth muscle controls the blood vessel diameter and also the diameter of the bronchioles, which also is affected by epinephrine, as we learned in the pulmonary lectures. So what is the effect? Again, you might say fight or flight. Yeah, that's true, but think more deeply. When we get into the mechanics of the effect, we are changing the muscle tone around tubes and affecting the heart so that it increases cardiac output. So what this table does is kind of brings hormones that we've already encountered and displays them in a way that is very traditional for endocrinology. What's the hormone? Who's it secreted by? What's the target cell? What's the effect? Okay, now let's turn and take a look at some of these effects. We've listed the nitty-gritty of a lot of these effects, but I want to take a step back and look at effects from a bigger standpoint. If I were to take a look at all the hormones and try to come up with some major themes for what are the effects on the cells, what would they be? And I personally have come up with 4 themes. Now, I believe this is my own list. I don't think I got it from anywhere, so you probably won't find it in a textbook. But when I look at all the hormones and all the different effects they have, I kind of group them into these themes. One of the ones that I feel like is most obvious, given the hormones that we've already seen, is going to be to change the permeability of a membrane to something. What does that actually mean? To change the permeability of a membrane means to make it easier or harder for that something to cross the plasma membrane. And typically, this is done by either adding or taking away membrane transporters for that something. But it can also be changing how transporters that are already there work. Let me give you some examples. Vasopressin, or antidiuretic hormone, is a perfect example. So what does that do? By inserting aquaporins, you make that membrane more permeable to water. So you change the permeability of the collecting duct to water and therefore make it easier to reabsorb water. Other examples of this are going to be aldosterone, which changes the permeability of the basolateral membrane to sodium and potassium. And then also epinephrine on pacemaker cells. In this case, we're not adding or subtracting membrane transporters. We're simply taking a channel protein that's twisted and we're untwisting it, which makes it easier for sodium to get through. Okay, so that's certainly one potential response of target cells. Another potential response of target cells is to alter something that's already inside the cell. And that could be some sort of metabolic pathway, or if it's a smooth muscle cell or cardiac muscle cell, it could be to alter that muscle tone somehow. So I have this here as alter metabolism or smooth muscle tone. We're basically taking something that's already in the cell and we're changing how it's working. Very often, these use G protein coupled receptors, and they use signal transduction and potentially amplification, as you can see here. So these are themes from a prior lecture. An example of this would be epinephrine and its effect on smooth muscle. Okay, we can actually have an effect that's a little bit more profound, where the effect is to actually turn on or off genes in the nucleus. So if you want to do something where you're making new stuff or you're shutting down the production of new protein, those might be called genomic effects. And an example of this is erythropoietin. When erythropoietin binds to a hematopoietic stem cell, it turns on genes that say, I want you to divide, so make 2 daughter cells, and then I want one of those daughter cells to start making a lot of hemoglobin and degrading all of the other cellular parts so that you can become a mature red blood cell. So that is referred to as a genomic effect to alter the DNA expression. The last response seems silly when you first look at it. This response is to basically control the secretion of another hormone. You heard that right. So you'll have hormone A that binds to a cell that has a receptor for A, and then that receptor cell, that target cell, is usually an endocrine cell itself and secretes hormone B. So hormone A controls the secretion of hormone B. Now, typically it promotes the secretion, but it can also stop the secretion as well. It depends on the hormone. This seems very strange because you can have hormone A controls hormone B, which then controls hormone C. Like, why do you have a pathway? There are reasons. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't have these pathways. So there's benefits to having this chain of hormones where hormone A controls the secretion of hormone B, which controls the secretion of hormone C. And we're going to take a look at these chains when we get into reproductive endocrinology and also cortisol. So you'll see this theme kind of mature in our lectures where we'll really be able to explore the benefits of this. But for now, I just want to describe the fact that this is a potential response. Target cell's response is to basically secrete or stop secreting their own hormone. If you are a hormone whose job is simply to control the secretion of another hormone, you get a special name. You are called a tropic hormone. Not to be confused with trophic. There's no H in there. It is just tropic. So a tropic hormone is going to be one that controls the secretion of another hormone. And we see this in the hypothalamus pituitary gland axis, which is going to be a huge topic in a subsequent lecture. So we're going to learn about how the hypothalamus secretes tropic hormones that control the release of other hormones from the anterior pituitary gland. All right, that's where I'm going to stop here. In our next lecture, we are going to look at the chemical structure of hormones and how that influences their behavior. I'll see you then.